The cameras were rolling. The room was full. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had come prepared, with data, reports, and the fierce clarity she's known for. She looked Ibrahim Traoré in the eye and demanded answers. Is this leadership or just another disguise for control? The crowd leaned in, and then without raising his voice, without glancing at a single note, Traoré responded. He didn't defend. He didn't deflect. He told a story so raw, so disarmingly honest, that it didn't just silence AOC, it silenced the room. No applause, no interruption, just breathless stillness and truth. And in that moment, something shifted, not just between two leaders, but between two worlds. This is a dramatized account. The events and dialogue in this story are fictional, crafted to explore deeper truths about power, dignity, and what it means to lead. While the details are imagined, the emotional impact is real. Now listen closely, because what Ibrahim said next wasn't just for her, it was for all of us. Scene: United Nations Human Rights Summit, New York City. The camera panned across the marble expanse of the UN General Assembly Hall. An ocean of navy suits, shimmering national pins, and whispered translations echoing through headsets in 6 languages. Under the carved emblem of the United Nations, tension hung not like fog, but like a held breath. This was not just another summit. This was the Human Rights Summit, and the name itself carried weight. It was where countries showed their best faces and feared their worst truths would be exposed. Suddenly, murmurs quieted. A side door opened with the soft click of diplomatic urgency. A name flashed briefly across teleprompters. AOC had entered the building. She wasn't flanked by security, no entourage of photographers. Just her, a leather folder in one hand, a folded sheet of paper in the other. She wore a charcoal gray blazer, not flashy, not dull, but deliberate, serious, intentional. Cameras turned, phones lifted. Somewhere a journalist whispered, "She's about to light a match." As Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez approached the podium, she didn't smile. She didn't wave. She placed the paper down with care and looked out over the sea of faces, some curious, some skeptical, some already looking away. She paused. The silence was not polite, it was bracing. Then she spoke. "Distinguished delegates, today I come not with accusation, but with a question." The room stilled. What if the greatest threat to democracy isn't a bullet or a coup, but a carefully curated silence? She let that linger. Eyes shifted, heads tilted. A few pens stopped moving. There is a leader, admired by many, feared by some, whose name has reshaped the way Africa is viewed on the world stage. Ibrahim Traoré, a man who rose from the ranks of revolution to the seat of presidency in Burkina Faso. A man whose promises of sovereignty have reignited pride across a continent long underestimated. A murmur rippled through the chamber. The name was out. And yet, she continued, we must ask, can pride coexist with suppression? Can progress be genuine if it silences its critics? A sharp intake of breath was caught on a microphone. AOC reached into her folder and unfolded a letter. Creased down the middle, edges slightly worn. She held it up. This, she said, is a letter from a journalist in Ouagadougou. His name, intentionally omitted, for his safety. A pause, she scanned the room. 3 months ago, he published a piece criticizing military operations. 2 days later, he vanished. No charges, no trial, just gone. Screens blinked on across the room. A map of Burkina Faso faded in behind her. Red pins, missing voices, censored broadcasts. Then she read, "When we silence dissent, we don't protect the people. We protect our fear." The room didn't move. It was the kind of quote that didn't ask for applause. It asked for reckoning. Her voice lowered. This isn't about one country. This is about what we allow in the name of stability, about who gets to define dignity, about whether global admiration gives someone immunity from hard questions. Some delegates looked down. Others looked straight ahead, stone-faced. One West African ambassador clenched a pen tightly, as if caught between loyalty and truth. AOC folded the paper again. Deliberate, controlled. Then she looked directly into the camera, speaking to more than the delegates now, speaking to a continent, speaking to him. To President Traoré, I say this: your voice has inspired many, but the test of leadership is not how many listen when you speak, it's how many are allowed to speak when you listen. Silence, deep and heavy, not a single clap, not a single cough, just the echo of words that refuse to dissolve. And far away, 8 time zones ahead, in a private office in Ouagadougou, a screen flickered. Ibrahim Traoré sat still, one hand resting lightly on a sealed envelope. No aides moved. No interpreter dared speak. He stared at the screen as if replaying each word. And then he smiled, just slightly, because something had just begun. And it would not end with applause. It would end with an answer. This is only the beginning. What Traoré does next will not just challenge AOC's words. It will challenge how the world defines power, truth, and the right to be heard. Stay with us. The presidential office in Ouagadougou was unusually dim that afternoon. The heavy drapes muted the outside heat, and the hum of the aging ceiling fan was the only interruption to the otherwise still room. In the center sat a large wooden desk, clean, spare, save for a single glass of water and a muted screen mounted on the far wall. On that screen, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had just finished speaking. Her words hadn't faded so much as they had settled into the corners of the room, into the silence of men trained not to flinch. Around President Ibrahim Traoré, 4 advisors stood motionless. One held a notepad he hadn't touched since the first minute of her speech. Another had instinctively reached for his phone to track headlines, but stopped mid-motion when he realized the president hadn't moved. Traoré didn't blink. He hadn't spoken since the address began. His eyes remained locked on the black screen, now slowly fading to the summit's neutral logo. The sentence still echoed in the room, even though it had passed several minutes ago. The test of leadership is not how many listen when you speak. It's how many are allowed to speak when you listen. No outrage, no scoff, no rebuttal rising up in his chest. Only breath. Deep, quiet even. He leaned back slightly, hands resting calmly on the arms of his chair, fingertips meeting at the center in thought, not defensiveness. It wasn't the first time a Western figure had questioned his leadership, but it was the first time one had done so not with accusation, but with precision. Behind him, someone finally broke the silence. "Mr. President?" the youngest of the 4 asked gently, unsure if he was speaking too soon. "Would you like us to schedule a press briefing?" Another advisor cleared his throat. "Or prepare talking points?" Traoré remained still. The fan creaked. Outside, the faint sound of a market radio drifted through the closed windows. He inhaled, then finally spoke. Calm, clear, unmistakable. "Prepare a response," he said. 4 words. Then after a beat, not to defend, to clarify. He rose slowly from his chair, walking to the window, placing both palms gently on the frame. The city stretched beyond, alive in its usual rhythm. Vendors arranging tomatoes on wooden carts, children playing barefoot football in narrow alleys, the call to prayer rising faintly in the distance. "People think silence is strategy," he said without turning around. "But sometimes it is space. Space to let the noise pass so the truth can enter." The advisors didn't respond. They had learned this about him, that his silences weren't voids. They were calculations, observations, moments of wait. "She asked a question I've waited years to answer," Traoré continued, "just not in the language she's used to hearing it in." He turned around now, face composed, eyes sharper than before. Not angry, but focused, like a sculptor standing before a block of stone. "They don't want explanation. They want contradiction. They want us to yell, because yelling looks more like guilt than dignity." He picked up a small photograph from his desk, one that had been there since his first week in office. A family of 5, standing barefoot outside a brick home, 2 small solar panels balanced above their roof, a child holding a school book like it was treasure. "This is who we answer to," he said softly. "Not summit rooms, not sound bites." The oldest advisor, a former diplomat who had served under 3 governments, nodded. And what should the response be, Mr. President? Traoré looked at the photo once more, then placed it carefully back down. It should be honest, he said, and it should not try to impress anyone, only to remind them that we are not what they edited us to be. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Something had shifted, not in the headlines, but in the air around him. He would not speak first to reporters. He would speak last and loudest, without ever raising his voice. It started with a single tweet. A young university student in Ghana posted a photo of her grandmother sitting on a wooden stool outside their home, holding an old transistor radio. The caption read, "She listened to AOC today." She didn't flinch. She just whispered, "Again, they speak for us, not to us." Below the photo, she added the hashtag Let Africa Speak. By midnight, it was trending in 4 countries. By dawn, it had reached 40. In Nairobi, university campuses erupted in digital debate. In Abidjan, musicians released freestyles referencing AOC's speech. In Lagos, influencers stitched her speech with footage of power outages and market scenes, asking pointedly, "Does she even know how many speak here? Just because you can't hear us from Washington doesn't mean we're quiet." TikTok loops multiplied, some heartfelt, some biting. A young man in Dakar recorded a video whispering into a cracked smartphone mic, mimicking her tone. "If you want to listen, come sit with us under the mango tree." The hashtag Let Africa Speak transformed into a movement almost overnight. And as with all movements, there were fault lines. Some praised AOC's boldness. Finally, a Western figure daring to question African leadership without colonial arrogance. Others accused her of wrapping the same old pattern of judgment in progressive language. She had not accused, she had asked, but even questions, when spoken from power, echo like indictments. Western media rushed in to frame the moment. CNN ran with, "AOC challenges African autocrat at global summit." The Guardian offered a softer headline, "Ocasio-Cortez sparks continent-wide conversation on freedom and reform." Fox News called it woke imperialism. Politico described it as a clash of generations and geographies. One columnist in the Washington Post declared, "It is not her job to rescue Africa." Another in Le Monde countered, "But what if asking is not rescuing, but respecting?" All this noise, all this framing, all this heat. And yet, from Ouagadougou, silence. No tweet from the presidency, no press conference, no leaked statement, not even a diplomatic gesture of displeasure. The silence confused the pundits. Was he wounded? Was he planning a counterstrike? Was he ignoring her altogether? But inside the walls of the presidential residence, something quieter and more dangerous was happening. Ibrahim Traoré wasn't writing a rebuttal. He wasn't calling for speechwriters or camera crews. He sat alone in his study, beneath a single desk lamp, surrounded by things no Western journalist would recognize as significant. A child's drawing taped to the wall, an old map of rural solar installations, and a yellowed newspaper clipping from the early days of the Sankara Revolution. He was not preparing a statement. He was crafting a moment. He knew that anything said too soon would be dismissed as defensiveness. Anything too polished would be seen as PR. Anything reactive would miss the point entirely. So he waited. He watched. And when his advisors asked what he planned to say, he responded only, "Something they can't unhear." He began jotting notes, not lines, but truths. Not slogans, but memories. He wrote about the family whose home got electricity last month, not because of foreign aid, but because a local engineer retooled a rusted generator. He wrote about the girl who walked 6 kilometers to school, barefoot with a science book balanced on her head. He wrote about the silence that comes not from censorship, but from exhaustion, the kind of silence that follows generations of being spoken about and never to. One line he underlined 3 times. Power is not always loud, but it is always listening. When one of his aides peeked in and gently asked if it was time to respond, he waved them off. "Not yet," he said. "They want fire. I'll give them reflection. They expect noise. I'll give them stillness, because when stillness finally speaks, it echoes." The aide nodded, unsure if she understood, but she left without another word. Outside, the courtyard filled with the distant sound of children laughing. One of them kicked a ball that bounced against the wall of the residence. thudding softly like a heartbeat. Traoré looked up. He smiled. Not the smile of a man pleased with himself, but of one who remembered what mattered. He wasn't preparing to speak louder. He was preparing to speak deeper. And when he did, he knew. The world wouldn't just hear his answer. It would feel it. And that, he thought, was the only kind of answer worth giving. 2 days after the summit, the air in Harlem was thick with late summer heat. The storefronts along Malcolm X Boulevard buzzed with conversation, radios, and the scent of frying catfish from a corner deli. But inside the Marcus Garvey Community Center, things were quieter, tense even. The kind of quiet that comes not from absence, but from focus. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood near the back of the room, sipping from a paper cup of lukewarm coffee, her blazer folded over her arm. Around her, folding chairs were arranged in a loose circle. No microphones, no press, just voices, local organizers, youth leaders, faith elders, professors, and retired activists. Most of them black, all of them deeply rooted in the neighborhood. She had come to debrief, to reflect, maybe to breathe. She hadn't expected a crowd. But news of her speech had rippled far beyond the UN. Across Harlem, her name had surfaced again. Some called it bold, others risky. A few even whispered, career-defining. But in this room, no one was looking to praise or condemn. They were here to ask. A young organizer from the Bronx, no older than 22, leaned forward. You said what a lot of people were scared to. Calling out a leader, an African leader, on human rights? That took guts. There were nods around the circle. We don't do enough of that. We let culture excuse silence. AOC smiled politely but didn't interrupt. Her eyes scanned the room, gauging, listening. Another voice followed, sharper this time. You reminded folks that progress without transparency is just power in better clothes. Then from the far side of the circle, a cane tapped the wooden floor. Slow, deliberate. The room turned to look at Ms. Dolores Cunningham, 81 years old, former freedom rider, one of the last remaining voices from the original Harlem Voting Coalition. Her white dress was pressed to perfection, her eyes cloudy but still piercing. Young lady, she began gently, I admire your fire. AOC straightened slightly. But fire alone, Dolores continued, can burn what you don't yet understand. The room went still. Dolores folded her hands. I marched. I sat in. I buried friends who never got the chance to sit in a room like this. So believe me when I say, I know what silence can mean. But I also know, sometimes silence isn't suppression. Sometimes it's survival. She turned slightly toward AOC. You said that real leadership listens. But baby, do you know what real listening looks like on a continent you've never walked? In a village you've never slept in? Surrounded by ancestors you never met? AOC didn't flinch, but she did blink. Once, slowly. Dolores leaned back. You ever watch a mother boil water for rice and still find a way to teach her child the alphabet by candlelight? You ever see a teacher mark tests with a piece of charcoal because the ink ran out last week? Her voice softened. That's what it looks like to lead without being seen. So before we call that silence, maybe we should sit in it. For a moment, AOC said nothing. She looked down at her hands. Then with care, she replied, You're right, she said. I haven't lived those lives. I haven't seen that kind of resilience firsthand. But I also believe silence can't be immune from questions. Not if we're going to evolve as a global community. Dolores nodded slowly. That's fair. Just make sure your question doesn't sound like an answer. There was a soft murmur around the room. Not laughter, something else. Agreement, respect. Another elder spoke up. We want accountability everywhere. Here, there, across oceans. But what we don't want, what we can't have, is a world where only some voices get to ask the questions. AOC exhaled. Her shoulders relaxed, but her mind was clearly still racing. She reached into her bag and pulled out the folded copy of the speech she'd given at the UN. She held it up, not to read it, but to acknowledge it. This was meant to spark conversation, she said, not to define someone else's truth. Dolores smiled for the first time. Then maybe now, child, the real conversation's just begun. Outside, a car honked in the street. The sun shifted slightly, casting new shadows on the community room floor, and somewhere in the quiet that followed, it became clear. This moment wasn't about being right. It was about being ready to listen deeper than before. The sun had just dipped below the horizon when the documentary crew arrived in Kulpelago, a village too small to appear on most maps, but large enough to carry the weight of its own hopes. The dust from the day still lingered in the air, giving everything a faint amber glow. Children gathered barefoot near the edge of the communal hall, pointing shyly at the cameras, whispering to one another in Fufulde. In the distance, the soft buzz of solar inverters hummed like a new kind of heartbeat. The film team had come expecting hardship. What they found was something harder to define: intention. Inside the mud brick meeting house, lit by a string of warm solar bulbs hanging from a wooden beam, men and women sat side by side on woven mats. At the center of the room, a simple cardboard box rested on a table carved from old timber. On its front was a piece of notebook paper with the word "vote" written in black marker, both in French and in Moray. There were no observers from the UN, no translators, no international press, just villagers, some illiterate, some with calloused hands from years of planting millet, raising their voices to choose who would represent them in the Regional Development Council. It wasn't flashy, but it was real. A local teacher, Madame Issa, stood just outside the building, watching the line form. She was in her late 40s with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers. She had taught in the region for over 2 decades, long enough to remember when the only light in the schoolhouse came from kerosene lanterns and cell phone flashlights. Now, for the first time, the community center and nearby classrooms were powered by donated solar panels, installed not by foreign contractors, but by local trainees from the new vocational tech hub 20 miles away. When asked what she thought of this village-led election, she didn't hesitate. "We don't want democracy imported," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We want democracy rooted in our soil, our rhythms, our voices." The interviewer raised an eyebrow. "And what does that look like?" She looked toward the voting line. "It looks like this. No headlines, no suits, just choices, made by the people, for the people." One of the filmmakers captured a moment as a young woman, barefoot in a faded yellow dress, approached the voting table with her infant tied to her back. She dipped her thumb in black ink, pressed it on the ballot, and dropped it into the box with the kind of reverence usually reserved for church offerings. No one applauded. No one instructed her to pose for the camera. It was a ritual, not a performance. Outside, the film crew reviewed their footage. One whispered to another, "This doesn't fit the script." The other replied, "Maybe the script's wrong." A few meters away, an elder sat under a baobab tree, watching the proceedings with the stillness of someone who had seen decades roll by and knew the value of silence. When approached for comment, he simply said, "Let them film. Let the world see us choose, not just be chosen for." Back in Ouagadougou, when Ibrahim Traoré viewed the early cuts of the footage, he didn't say much. He watched a woman vote in sandals made from repurposed tires. He watched a 12-year-old boy carry a solar lantern for his grandmother as she walked to the polling place. He watched people with no formal schooling debate road maintenance proposals and irrigation rights like seasoned parliamentarians. Finally, he said, "This is what they don't understand." One advisor asked, "Who is they, Mr. President?" Traoré didn't look up. "The ones who think silence means we are waiting for instructions." He paused the video at the frame where the young mother cast her vote. "She wasn't voting for me," he said. "She was voting for herself, and that's more powerful than any summit soundbite." No one responded. There was nothing to add, because in a world where elections are often defined by their noise, this quiet village had just offered something louder than applause. Ownership. Not of a system borrowed, but of a future imagined from within. The meeting room was stripped of its usual decorum. No flags, no microphones. Just a long mahogany table beneath a flickering ceiling fan, and 5 chairs occupied by Traoré's senior advisors, 2 economists, 1 rural development specialist, a retired diplomat, and a former energy engineer. At the head of the table, President Ibrahim Traoré stood silently, both hands resting flat on an unmarked sheet spread out before him. It was a map, but not one anyone recognized. There were no country borders, no capital cities, no shaded territories or administrative zones. Just an outline of the nation's physical shape, empty except for hundreds of hand-drawn dots, some small and faint, others large and circled in red. The room was quiet, not out of fear, but curiosity. This, Traoré began, voice calm but unwavering, is not a map of power. It is not about provinces or parties or political districts. He stepped back, allowing the map to fully occupy the space between them. This is a map of silence. One of the economists leaned forward, squinting. Sir, what do the dots represent? Traoré looked at him, measured and clear. Places still without electricity. A murmur passed through the room. These red circles, he pointed to the larger marks. Communities where students take final exams using candlelight or the glow of phone flashlights. Places where a pregnant woman has to give birth without refrigeration for medicine. Where radios run on dying batteries in clinics close before nightfall. Not because the staff leaves, but because the light does. He let the weight settle. There was no judgment in his tone, but every word was precise. We talk about digital infrastructure, he continued. We talk about free speech. But in these places, these forgotten shadows, what does speech mean when you can't even charge a phone? What does voice mean when you can't hear the broadcast? What is freedom when the dark is more than just physical? It's institutional? The retired diplomat cleared his throat gently. Mr. President, with all respect, what does this mean in terms of our response to the summit? To AOC's remarks? Traoré walked slowly to the far wall and opened the blinds just slightly. Afternoon light spilled across the map. Dust shimmered in the beam. For a moment, the unlit spaces on the paper seemed almost to glow in reverse, shapes formed by absence. She questioned our openness, our media, our democracy, he said. But I wonder, did she ever see this? He tapped the map lightly. This is what we're trying to illuminate, not just land, but dignity. He turned back to face them fully now. I'm not writing a rebuttal. I'm not defending our press laws to someone who's never stood on the edge of a village where the only newspaper is a chalkboard updated weekly with announcements. He paused, letting the contrast speak for itself. But I will show them this, he said. The world wants spectacle. I want reality, because a camera pointed at a podium does not show progress. But a light bulb switching on in a forgotten town, that does. The engineer spoke up for the first time. Do you want us to update this data? No, Traoré replied. I want us to finish it. Not for the report, not for the media, but for every dot on that page that thinks they are not seen. He leaned over the table again and drew a single new mark on the southern edge of the map. One more village connected yesterday. One more voice that doesn't need permission to speak. And when I speak next, I will not recite statistics. I will hold this up and let the world see the real reason we build infrastructure. Not to look modern, but to make sure no child has to whisper their dreams in the dark. No one spoke for a long time, because in that room with the hum of the fan above and the glow of dust-lit sun, it became clear. Traoré wasn't preparing to respond like a politician. He was preparing to respond like a witness, not to defend the nation's image, but to defend its people's right to be seen. The marble floors of the Palais des Nations in Geneva echoed faintly as diplomats, delegates, and dignitaries trickled out of the Grand Conference Hall. Polished shoes and hushed voices disappeared behind double doors, replaced by the more honest, unguarded sound of fatigue. Another global forum had concluded, resolutions tabled, applause rationed, handshakes exchanged with mechanical grace. But in the corridor behind the main hall, under softer lights and absent of press, something real was about to unfold. Two security officers stood silently outside a side room. Inside, no cameras, no aides, no translators. Just two chairs, one pitcher of water, and the weight of everything unsaid. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez entered first, blazer still buttoned, tablet under one arm, eyes scanning the room with instinctive precision. She didn't pace. She didn't check her phone. She sat and waited. Then 5 minutes later, the door opened. Ibrahim Traoré stepped inside with the calm of someone who had nothing to prove. He carried no folder, no briefcase, just a single folded piece of paper in his jacket pocket. His eyes met hers. Steady, no smile, no scowl, just presence. They sat across from each other. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but taut. AOC spoke first. "I appreciate you agreeing to meet." Traoré nodded once, his expression unreadable. "I want to be clear," she continued. "I came with questions, not condemnation." His voice was calm, low, and deliberate. "Then I'll answer not with power," he said, "but with people." Her brow lifted slightly, caught between curiosity and caution. "I've read the commentary," he added. "I've heard the applause, the outrage, the headlines." She looked at him directly. "You didn't respond." He tilted his head gently. "Not publicly." "Why?" "Because when everyone else is shouting," he said, "sometimes the most radical thing you can do is wait until they have run out of breath." There was a pause. She leaned forward slightly. "And now?" "Now," he replied, "I speak not to defend my record, but to reflect yours back to you." Her eyes narrowed, intrigued. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded paper, placing it between them on the table. She looked down. A photograph, grainy, a classroom, mud walls, a blackboard covered in chalk math problems, children seated on benches, their faces lit by a single solar bulb hanging from the ceiling. "This," he said, tapping the image with his finger, "is what silence looks like in my country. Not the silence of oppression, the silence of effort, of children learning long after sunset, of mothers reading to daughters with the lights still on." AOC looked at the image longer than she intended. Her voice, when it returned, was quieter. "I never meant to accuse." "I know," he said, "but you questioned with a voice louder than the ones we've been trying to amplify for years." She folded her hands. "I questioned because I believe dignity demands scrutiny." "And I answered," he said gently, "because I believe scrutiny demands context." Another pause, this time heavier. She broke it first. "How do you balance it?" "Balance what?" "Progress and power." He didn't hesitate. "By remembering that power is not the goal," he said, "only the light switch." He leaned back. "You see us through the lens of what could go wrong. I live us through the weight of what's already gone wrong. My burden is not avoiding criticism. My burden is making sure that child in the photo has more than hope, that she has continuity." The words landed with a kind of honesty that didn't demand agreement, but made denial impossible. Finally, AOC nodded, slowly. "I didn't come here to win," she said, "but I also didn't come here to stay silent." Traoré gave her the smallest nod. "Then we are alike," he said, "because I didn't come here to be applauded. I came to be understood." The clock on the wall ticked forward. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was earned. They stood at the same time. And though they left through separate doors, something about the space between them had changed. Not less charged, but less closed. Because sometimes the most powerful confrontation isn't the one that ends in victory. It's the one that begins in listening. The lights inside the Geneva Press Auditorium weren't blinding, but they were sharp, clinical, designed more for clarity than warmth. Rows of international press sat waiting, notebooks poised, camera lenses trained. The official United Nations backdrop stood firm behind the simple wooden podium. There had been no advance notice, no prepared remarks released, just a brief media alert. "President Ibrahim Traoré will speak at 4 p.m. No questions." When he entered, there was no applause, no music, no entourage. Just the quiet shuffle of seats adjusting as the room prepared to capture something they assumed would be defensive, maybe defiant. But Traoré didn't carry a speech. He carried a photograph. Folded once, edges worn soft with time, he placed it gently on the podium surface. For a moment, he said nothing. He just looked at the room, not scanning for allies, not scanning for enemies, just meeting eyes. Then he spoke. "This," he said, his voice steady and unhurried, "is a family from the outskirts of Bobo Dioulasso." He unfolded the photo with care. The camera zoomed in. The image showed 5 people, mother, father, 3 children, standing in front of a modest brick home. Behind them, barely visible, 2 slim solar panels leaned on a wooden frame. The mother held a bucket. One child clutched a school book to his chest. The father's shirt was frayed at the collar. They used to boil water by fire, Traoré continued. On most days, smoke would fill the kitchen and sting the children's eyes. At night, they studied by candlelight. Sometimes not at all. A quiet pause, no rustling, no typing. But today, he said, lifting the photograph slightly, they boil it with light. They power their radio. The children finish homework after sunset. The mother started a small tea business with an electric kettle. His tone sharpened, not loud but focused. Not because of foreign aid, not because of charity, but because we trusted ourselves. He let that sentence sit. We trained local electricians. We sourced materials from the region. We didn't wait for a Western grant to bless us with dignity. We created it, panel by panel, wire by wire. A murmur rippled in the room, the kind that came not from disagreement, but from a shift in perception. He lowered the photograph, pressing it flat against the podium. When I was asked days ago if we silenced dissent, I chose not to answer immediately, because I did not want my reply to compete with the noise. I wanted it to compete with memory. He looked up again, the memory of what it felt like to be ignored, to be spoken about, never spoken with. He took a breath. Yes, we still have challenges. Yes, we are imperfect. But understand this, our progress will never look familiar to you. It won't fit the models of your institutions. It won't reflect your political timelines. Because our reforms are not for global approval. They're for people like the ones in this photograph. His fingers tapped the podium once. Not for emphasis, for grounding. This isn't about grasping power, he continued. It's about ending the dependence on applause. It's about building something that lasts beyond a soundbite, beyond a summit. A reporter in the second row lowered her pen. Another leaned forward, unsure whether to record or simply listen. Traoré's voice dropped slightly. I'm not asking to be exempt from scrutiny, but I am asking this. When you scrutinize us, will you look at the homes where the lights have just turned on? Will you ask what freedom looks like when it's powered by a single bulb and the decision to believe in ourselves? He paused one final time, then added almost as a whisper, because this photo may look ordinary to you, but to me, it's a revolution. And with that, he folded the picture back into thirds and slipped it into his coat pocket. Then, without waiting for applause, because he hadn't come for any, he stepped down from the podium and walked out. He didn't look back, but the silence he left behind was louder than any headline. The interview was not supposed to happen. Not this soon, not this publicly. But after Traoré's surprise address in Geneva, where he walked off the podium with nothing but a photograph and a single line that rewrote the room, this photo may look ordinary to you, but to me, it's a revolution. The world demanded more, and unexpectedly, so did Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The two had agreed quietly to appear on a live-stream dialogue hosted by a neutral outlet, a policy think tank known for avoiding headlines and focusing on hard questions. No moderator, no crowd, just two chairs, two microphones, and two very different ways of seeing the world. AOC opened first. She did not smile. She did not ease in with flattery. Her voice was clear, her notes crisp. I want to start by acknowledging the power of what you shared. That image, that story, it landed, she said, facing Traoré directly. But I also want to make space for what still concerns many of us. She held up a document. According to Reporters Without Borders, she continued, Burkina Faso's press freedom index has dropped 14 places in the last 2 years. We have documented cases of journalists disappearing, internet outages during protests, and regional radio stations being shut down without explanation. She paused, not to escalate, but to let the data breathe. I believe deeply in self-determination, she added, but I also believe that progress can't be separated from accountability. Dignity and dissent have to coexist. Otherwise, we trade one silence for another. The room was quiet. Traoré didn't rush to respond. He simply looked at the printed reports she placed gently on the small table between them. Then he looked back up, not dismissively but deliberately. We do not censor ideas, he said. We challenge narratives that were never ours to begin with. His tone was calm, not defensive, but deeply assured, like someone describing the architecture of a home he'd built with his own hands. Every statistic you just named, he continued, was gathered by institutions based thousands of miles away, measuring us through frameworks they built for themselves. And we're expected to conform to those frames because deviation looks like danger. He leaned forward slightly. We do not fear questions, we fear misrepresentation. We fear that when we speak in our own dialects, through our own systems, it won't count as freedom because it doesn't resemble yours. AOC nodded slowly. So how do you separate challenging a narrative from silencing opposition? By asking who's telling the story, he replied. Is it the critic who writes from afar? Or the community leader who solves water shortages without a headline? The blogger paid by clicks? Or the grandmother who teaches under a tree without internet? He placed a hand on the table. Not on the report, but beside it. We have made mistakes, he said. We are not immune to corruption or overreach. But show me one country, one, where the road to dignity wasn't paved with imperfect bricks. AOC's eyes narrowed, not in disapproval, but in focus. You're right, she said. No country is perfect, and I don't pretend America is an exception. She looked down at her papers, then back at him. But the risk, she said softly, is that when the world sees journalists vanish and nobody speaks out, it becomes harder to distinguish between narrative and truth. Silence creates its own story. Traoré nodded. That's why I broke it. There was no applause, no victory declared, just two leaders sitting across from each other, not in combat, but in confrontation, with the uncomfortable middle ground between information and interpretation laid bare. And for the first time, perhaps, they weren't debating power. They were debating perspective. AOC closed her folder. Maybe the most dangerous thing about data, she said, is how easy it is to turn people into numbers. Traoré replied without pause. And the most dangerous thing about numbers is how easily they erase the people who don't fit inside them. No follow-up, no interruption, just silence. A real one. Not of suppression, but of reflection. And in that silence, something rare happened. Not consensus, but clarity. Not agreement, but understanding. And in a world starved of both, that alone was newsworthy. The car pulled to a gentle stop just beyond the school gate, its tires crunching over dry earth and scattered pebbles. There were no reporters trailing behind, no official convoy, no podium waiting in the sun. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepped out alone, dressed in light cotton and practical shoes, her hair tied back, eyes scanning the landscape not as a politician, but as a guest. The school in front of her was modest, a single-story building painted in warm, sun-washed colors, its walls rough and uneven. The playground was a stretch of packed earth marked by a worn soccer ball and the laughter of children who had no idea who she was. And that was exactly how she wanted it. She followed the headmistress, a woman named Miriam, through a narrow corridor shaded by a corrugated tin roof. Inside, classrooms buzzed with quiet activity. Wooden desks, chalkboards scuffed from years of lessons, and children with wide eyes and sunlit faces. What caught AOC's attention, though, weren't the students or even the simplicity of the space. It was the walls. Hand-painted murals stretched across them, uneven but vibrant. One showed a girl filling a bucket from a new water tap, smiling wide. Another displayed solar panels beaming down power into a classroom lit by a single glowing bulb. A third, faded but still proud, depicted a tree with words painted in both French and Moorish. Patience, courage, connaissance. Patience, courage, knowledge. She stopped in front of a fourth mural, painted by children. It showed a small girl holding a book above her head, standing on a ladder made of words. Each rung was labeled light, water, school, voice. At the top, barely visible, the word future. Miriam spoke quietly beside her. We ask our students to paint what matters to them. Most draw roads, or books, or the sun. AOC nodded slowly, her throat tighter than expected. No slogans, no cameras, no staged moment, just the steady truth of what a classroom can mean when built from within. She took one more look at the ladder on the wall, and without saying a word, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a pen, and under the last word, future, She wrote one more. Hours. The classroom was still. The bell for recess had rung minutes ago, but most of the children lingered, peeking shyly from behind door frames or hovering just close enough to watch Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez without being seen. She sat on the edge of a desk, speaking softly with the teacher, occasionally glancing toward the colorful murals and open windows where sunlight pooled gently on the floor. Then from the back of the room, a small girl stepped forward. She was no more than 7. Her uniform was neatly patched, her braids slightly uneven. In her hands, she held a folded piece of paper, creased in the middle, the edges worn soft from being held too tightly for too long. Her fingers trembled just slightly as she approached. AOC looked down, surprised but patient, and offered a smile that said, "Take your time." The girl didn't speak right away. She unfolded the paper slowly, revealing a drawing done in thick crayon lines. Bright, honest, untrained. There was a small house with a tin roof, a glowing sun in the corner, and next to the house, a smiling stick figure holding a red book. Above the figure, carefully spelled in block letters, was a single word. Moi. Me. The girl looked up at her, eyes wide, voice barely above a whisper. I can dream now. The sentence landed heavier than any applause, heavier than any speech. AOC felt the words sink deep into her chest before they reached her eyes. She blinked hard, the burn of tears swift and undeniable. There was no one watching, no camera to capture it, no quote to package neatly for headlines. Just this child, this drawing, this moment that cracks something open. She knelt to meet the girl's gaze. "What do you dream of?" she asked gently. The girl thought for a moment, then pointed at the book in the drawing. "To be the one who writes it." For a long second, AOC said nothing. She simply nodded, folding the paper carefully, holding it with both hands like it was something sacred. Outside, the other children were laughing, chasing shadows in the courtyard. But inside, something had shifted. Not politically, not diplomatically, but personally. A crayon drawing had just changed everything. The hotel room was quiet, save for the low hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional sound of distant motorbikes echoing through the streets of Ouagadougou. The curtains were drawn, the lights dimmed, and a single desk lamp cast a warm glow across the notepad lying open in front of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Her blazer hung neatly over the back of the chair, her shoes tucked beneath the table. She sat barefoot, sleeves rolled, a pen in hand but unmoving. The folded crayon drawing rested beside the notebook. She hadn't touched it since returning from the school visit, but its presence pulled at her attention like a weight on the page. Every so often, her eyes drifted to it, the crooked house, the bright sun, the figure with the book, and the simple word moi. For a long while, she didn't write anything. She just thought about the murals, the girl's voice, the ladder painted on the wall, the look in President Traoré's eyes when he spoke of dignity, not as a slogan, but as a daily decision. Finally, she lowered the pen to the paper. Maybe leadership isn't about exporting freedom, she wrote slowly. Maybe it's about witnessing it in its own form. She paused. The sentence was heavy. It felt like it had been sitting inside her for days, maybe longer. We spend so much time trying to fix systems we barely understand, and not enough time understanding the people living inside them. She thought back to Geneva, to the way she'd asked questions with certainty, and how Traoré had answered not with statistics, but with stories. Sometimes I think the most radical thing a leader can do is admit they didn't see something coming, and stay long enough to learn why. She exhaled, set the pen down, and closed the notebook gently. For once, she didn't feel the need to post a reflection, to press send on a statement, or polish the moment for anyone else. This was not a lesson she could turn into policy. Not yet. It was something quieter, something still forming, something unlearned. And in that stillness, she realized, maybe this too was leadership. To sit with discomfort, to name what you didn't know, and to carry it home. The room wasn't built for spectacle. There were no rows of flags, no polished moderator with a carefully balanced script. The chairs were mismatched, the walls bare, and the lighting unflattering. More overhead utility than studio design. A single camera streamed the feed live to a modest audience online. most of whom had found the link through quiet whispers on social media and a single shared post: no lights, no makeup, just truth. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat on one side of the table, a simple notebook in front of her, a small mic clipped to her collar. Across from her, President Ibrahim Traoré leaned forward, his hands clasped loosely, elbows resting on the table's worn wooden surface. There was no translator, no timer, just presence. The stream began without fanfare. AOC cleared her throat softly. Then she began. "I spoke before I fully saw," she said, her voice steady but stripped of performance. "And that's on me." There was no spin in her tone, no gesture for applause, just admission. "I came into this conversation carrying a set of assumptions," she continued. "I asked questions that deserved to be asked, but I asked them too early, maybe too sharply, and from too far away." She looked directly at Traoré, then back at the camera. "What I've seen since, what I've heard, what I've felt, has shifted something. Not in my values, but in my understanding." Traoré didn't respond right away. He allowed her words to settle, to live in the space without rushing to fill it. Then with quiet composure, he replied, "Clarity doesn't always come before criticism," he said. "Sometimes it comes after, and that too is valuable." He glanced briefly toward the camera, then returned his gaze to her. "You asked questions rooted in principle, and I respect that, but I needed time to show you that our answers are rooted in something else, something messier, slower, less visible to headlines." He paused. "We don't broadcast dignity the same way. Ours is quieter, but it's no less real." AOC nodded, folding her hands. "What struck me most wasn't your policy," she said. "It was your people, the ones I met, the stories they told. None of it sounded like silence to me. It sounded like resilience." Traoré smiled faintly. "We have always spoken, but the world prefers our suffering. It sells better." He leaned back slightly. "When we start talking about solutions, about autonomy, the cameras often turn off." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Tonight's camera was still on, but it wasn't glamorized. It wasn't designed for virality. It was raw, lit harshly, truthfully. AOC tapped the edge of her notebook. "This isn't a debate," she said, "and I'm not here to defend my record or rewrite yours. I'm here to acknowledge that questions must evolve as understanding deepens." Traoré responded without hesitation. "And answers must be given without fear, even if they don't match the language of the question." The stream kept rolling. No one interrupted. No one pivoted. No one raised their voice. There was no winning happening here. No applause to chase. No headlines to manufacture. Just two people from different continents sitting in the same room, making space. Not for themselves, but for what they hadn't yet understood about each other. And in that shared silence, broken only by honest words, something rare emerged. Not agreement, but something better. Recognition. Deeper to enter the room. Ibrahim Traoré sat forward, but he didn't reach for notes. He didn't clear his throat to pivot toward statistics. He didn't recite a list of policy wins or chart progress by numbers. Instead, he exhaled. Long, measured. And then he spoke, not as a president, but as a man carrying history on his back. "I could tell you how many kilometers of roads we've paved," he said quietly, "or how many households now have light for the first time, but I won't." His voice didn't rise. It fell into something more intimate, because there are things heavier than data. Grief, for one. My generation inherited graves with no names and wounds that never made the news. Some of us buried fathers we barely knew because they died fighting to be heard. And still, we are told to be polite, grateful, quiet. He looked down at his hands, calloused from a life before politics. "We don't speak because we want to be admired," he said. "We speak because we're tired of being spoken about. For too long, people with accents softer than ours wrote our stories, shaped our reputations, and made our silences feel like complicity." AOC listened without moving. The room had shifted. Even the camera seemed to draw closer, as if pulled by the gravity of what was being said. "We are not afraid of dialogue," Traoré continued. "We are afraid of déjà vu. that we will explain again and again, and still be reduced to a single story, a headline, a statistic, a problem to be solved, not a people to be understood. He looked up now, not accusing, simply steady. We do not fear criticism. We fear the repetition of history, the kind that starts with pity and ends with control. And with that, he leaned back, folding his hands loosely in his lap. He had not defended himself. He had not needed to. Because sometimes leadership doesn't come wrapped in policy. It walks in with memory, speaks with grief, and asks only one thing in return: to be heard without needing to explain why it matters. The final minutes of the live stream felt different. The tension had thinned, not dissolved, but transformed into something steadier. The kind of weight that doesn't crush, but anchors. Both Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ibrahim Traoré sat with their hands still, eyes clear, not searching for the next point to win, but for the right words to leave behind. AOC leaned into the mic. Her voice wasn't softer, it was fuller. I came here to challenge a president, she said, her words slow and deliberate. But I found a people. She glanced toward Traoré, then let her eyes settle on the camera, the millions watching from far beyond the room. I came with facts, with questions, and with a framework. But frameworks don't breathe. People do. And what I witnessed, what I was invited to see, wasn't perfect. It wasn't clean. But it was real. And realness demands respect, even when it doesn't offer agreement. She let the silence hold. Traoré nodded once, then leaned forward. I was questioned by the West, he began, but I answered with home. His tone was calm, not rehearsed, not packaged. When the spotlight came, we did not scramble for polish. We pointed to our people, to the quiet builders, the mothers who stretch single incomes into survival, the teachers who mark exams by candlelight, the girl who draws a book and writes moi beneath it. He paused just enough to make the room feel like it was breathing with him. You don't need to agree with how we lead, but you must understand who we lead and why we lead them the way we do. AOC folded her notebook, but didn't put it away. She wasn't finished learning. Neither was he. The camera panned slightly, capturing both of them in the frame. Two different paths, two different philosophies, but one moment rooted in something rare, mutual recognition. Not alignment, but acknowledgement. And in a world obsessed with winners and sound bites, it wasn't applause that closed the conversation. It was stillness. Because sometimes the highest form of respect isn't agreement, it's staying in the room long enough to understand. It was late autumn in Washington, D.C. The leaves had thinned, their golden armor now scattered across sidewalks that ran beside monuments. The city, always buzzing with policy chatter and filtered press, was quieter this week, except for the murmurs about a conversation that had crossed continents and algorithms. Michelle Obama sat in a simple chair. No backdrop of the White House, no presidential seal, just a softly lit room at the edge of a community arts center in Chicago. She had agreed to the interview not because of politics, but because of something else, something she couldn't stop thinking about since the live stream ended. The interviewer asked, "You watched the entire exchange between Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and President Traoré?" Michelle smiled, not with amusement, but with recognition. "I didn't just watch it," she said. "I felt it, every pause, every word that wasn't just spoken, but lived." She folded her hands in her lap the same way she had done countless times as First Lady, during state dinners, town halls, when meeting mothers who had lost their sons. "But you know," she continued, "there was a time, not that long ago, when I thought dignity had one face, a certain posture, a certain vocabulary, a certain history." The interviewer leaned forward. "And now?" Michelle's gaze softened. "Now I know it speaks many languages. Sometimes it wears a tie and speaks at Harvard. Sometimes it speaks through solar panels, drawn in crayon by a little girl in Burkina Faso." She paused, eyes steady. "And sometimes it sits across from power not to destroy it, but to ask if it's willing to listen." The footage cut to moments from the live stream. AOC saying, "That's on me," and Traoré replying, "We're tired of being spoken about." Michelle continued, "What I saw in that moment wasn't a clash of egos. It wasn't even disagreement, really. It was two people trying to reach for something larger than themselves. Truth that doesn't fit neatly into policy documents. Empathy that refuses to wait for permission. She lifted the sleeve of her jacket slightly, revealing a small bracelet. It was handmade, beads the colors of the Pan-African flag. A gift, she explained, from a school she'd once visited in Mali. There's a reason the world paid attention to that conversation, Michelle said, because it was raw, because it was real, and because we're starving for leaders who know that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like saying, I didn't know, but I'm here now. The interviewer hesitated, then asked gently, do you think either of them changed? Michelle looked out the window just briefly. I think they both became more dangerous, in the best way. Dangerous how? Because they showed the world something our politics tries hard to erase, that listening is not surrender, that compassion doesn't weaken your stance, it deepens your understanding, and that sometimes staying silent while someone tells their truth is the most courageous thing you can do. She smiled again, this time with warmth. When I watched Alexandria and Ibrahim, I saw the beginning of something. Not a partnership, not a headline, but a possibility. The camera cut again, this time to the drawing the little girl gave AOC. A house, a son, a book. Michelle's voice returned in voiceover. That little girl didn't need the perfect government. She needed the dignity of being seen, of knowing her voice could echo, even if it started in a village most of the world will never find on a map. She leaned forward, closing her final thought not with grandeur, but clarity. If we want a better world, we have to be brave enough to let our definitions evolve, of justice, of dignity, of each other. The screen faded to black, then a single line appeared. Dignity isn't one story, it's the courage to hear another. It took the journalist nearly half a day by motorbike from Ouagadougou, following a dirt trail that veered off the main highway and into the Sahel's dry embrace. The house wasn't marked by signs or GPS, it was marked by memory, an old photograph, shared across continents during Traoré's address. A home built of mud brick, shaded by a baobab, and lined with a simple solar panel on the roof. The door was painted blue. A woman greeted him, eyes wide but kind. Yes, she said with a small laugh. This is the house from the picture, but it looks better now. We've added color. Inside, the living room was modest but bright. Woven mats covered the floor. A solar-powered fan hummed softly in the corner. And pinned to the wall, near a shelf of school books and dried maize, was a freshly printed sheet of paper in English and French. AOC's speech. My daughter printed it from her teacher's computer, the mother said, smoothing the corners. She said, Mama, this lady spoke like she was thinking of me. The daughter appeared then, maybe 12 years old, hair braided neatly, holding a small notebook and a pen. Her name was Aissata. Her eyes shone with curiosity. She pointed to the quote on the page. When we silence dissent, we do not protect the people. We protect our own fear. She says this, the girl whispered, and then listened after. That's why I liked her. Outside, the sun began its descent behind the trees, casting a soft glow on the roof. The same roof that once bore only heat and dust, now catching light and possibility. The journalist asked one final question. What's changed most? The mother thought for a long moment. Before we hoped, now we connect. Then Aissata added quietly but clearly, and now when I draw the sun, I draw it smiling. It appeared without warning. No timestamp, no author, no watermark. Just a quiet upload to a global forum often used by young diplomats and policy students. The thread title read simply, Observation after the forum. No introduction, no claim of authority, only paragraphs that read more like reflection than opinion. They carried no aggression, no sides, just a quiet pulse of clarity. I watched a live stream expecting a clash. What I witnessed was a pause, a rare kind of stillness in politics, where power was not flexed but humbled. I saw a congresswoman retract a sentence to make room for a story, and I saw a president resist applause to name a pain that hadn't healed. It went on line after line, not praising personalities but acknowledging a shift. Subtle, quiet, and possibly historic. No hashtags, no calls to action, just language meant to land softly. This isn't a fairy tale. They didn't hold hands, they didn't agree on the problem, but they finally agreed to listen. The letter ended there. No closing, no name. In the hours that followed, people reposted it across platforms, from youth forums in Ghana to university networks in New York, from WhatsApp groups in the Sahel to Reddit threads in Brussels. Some believed the letter came from a UN translator who'd been in the room. Others insisted it was a student. A few said Michelle Obama herself might have penned it, quietly, but no one could prove anything. It didn't matter. The letter had done something rare. It softened the volume. It gave language to those who were moved but couldn't yet explain why. And in doing so, it stitched one more thread between two leaders, two continents, and all those watching in between. Because sometimes what lasts isn't the speech, it's the silence that followed it, and what we dared to hear inside it. It was a rainy afternoon in Washington, the kind that soaked even the marble steps of the Capitol in quiet gray. AOC walked without entourage, holding a slim archival tube in her hand. She didn't bring reporters. No statements were prepared. Inside the Library of Congress, the temperature dropped slightly. Preservation rules. A clerk offered a respectful nod as she was guided toward a submission room rarely used by politicians, mostly reserved for scholars and legacy keepers. She unrolled the paper carefully. The colors were faint now, faded by time, but still visible. A yellow sun, a home drawn with shaky lines, a woman in a red dress standing next to a book larger than herself. At the bottom, a child's scrawl, "I can dream now." She labeled it herself in deliberate handwriting. Unspoken testimony. The attending archivist asked gently, "Do you want to add context?" AOC shook her head. "No, context would only limit it. This taught me more than any report ever did." For a moment, she stayed there in silence, her fingers still resting on the edge of the page, as if reluctant to let it go. Outside, the rain hadn't stopped, but the clouds had begun to part slightly, light streaming in through tall windows onto the reading desk below. A small group of students passed by, whispering in awe as they realized who she was, but she didn't notice. Her gaze remained on the drawing. It wasn't a trophy. It wasn't proof of a political win. It was a reminder that leadership is not measured by volume, that policy sometimes begins with presence, and that one crayon drawing in the right hands can become more enduring than any headline. She stepped away slowly, leaving the page behind, forever preserved, filed between declarations and constitutions. Not because it carried authority, but because it carried a child's hope. And hope, when given space, is its own kind of law. The speech that began in New York now echoed across savannas and red clay villages. But it didn't echo in English. It moved in Moor and Fulfulde, translated not by professionals in studios, but by teachers, radio hosts, and elders sitting beneath neem trees with transistor radios and patient voices. In the town of Kudugu, an outdoor blackboard was wiped clean. On it, a young woman wrote the words slowly in chalk. "Leadership begins when listening replaces control." Beside her, an old man nodded. He had lived through colonial broadcasts, military decrees, silence by force. This felt different. Small towns set up benches in schoolyards. Children leaned against their mothers. A generator hummed faintly. They weren't there to clap or debate. They were there to reflect. One elder in Bobo Dioulasso said, "They used to speak about us. Now they're speaking near us. Soon, maybe with us." In another village, a pastor invited a local imam and a school teacher to co-host a reading circle of the transcript. "This isn't just an American speech," he said. "It's a mirror. We see what we've protected. We also see what we feared." Teenagers who had never watched C-SPAN asked questions. Why did she hesitate before she apologized? Why did he talk about grief before policy? Can you disagree with someone and still respect them? A student scribbled something in her notebook and whispered to her seatmate, "This is what democracy should feel like. No political banners, no rehearsed slogans, just open air, shared stories, and a message once spoken across oceans, now finding home in its own soil." They did not call it reconciliation. They did not call it awakening. They simply called it what it was: listening. And in a place where power had often been equated with silence, the quiet hum of conversation across dialects, generations, and histories sounded like something new. Not the end of disagreement, but the beginning of dignity. The screen fades to soft dusk over the Sahel. Children's voices echo in the background. Laughter, then quiet. The camera doesn't focus on any leader. No podiums, no applause. Just the landscapes that held the questions, and now hold something else. Voiceover begins, low and reflective. They didn't trade victories. They traded views. And for a moment, the world didn't need to pick a side. It just needed to hear both. A clip shows AOC, back in New York, placing the crayon drawing, creased but preserved, inside a plain folder. A librarian gently stamps it for the public archive. She writes in the guest log, unspoken testimony. In Ouagadougou, Traoré sits at a community circle. Not in uniform, not giving a speech, just listening. A child next to him, tugging at his sleeve, asking if America really had desserts too. Back on the voiceover. They were never meant to agree on everything. One came with data, the other with memory. One challenged in public, the other responded in silence. But both stepped beyond their comfort. And that's rarer than winning an argument. The final image is neither of them. It's of the house in the drawing, real now. The little girl peers out the window as her mother reads aloud from a newspaper, the article titled, "When Listening Crossed an Ocean." Voiceover ends. This wasn't a story about who was right. It was a story about who was willing. Willing to stay in the conversation, even when the headlines moved on. Willing to see dignity in a different language. Willing to believe that truth isn't weakened by empathy, it's completed by it. Fade to black. Then one final line appears on screen. This is a dramatized story. The people may be fictional, but the questions are real. Followed by a soft musical rise and the invitation. Subscribe for more stories that challenge, connect, and change. Content Alexandria. Rising, this story reminds us that courage doesn't always roar, it often listens. Watching AOC and President Traoré move from confrontation to conversation reveals something rare in global discourse: humility without surrender, strength without domination. It shows us that dignity isn't a Western export or an African resistance. It's a shared human inheritance. When leaders choose dialogue over dominance, everyone gains something: understanding. Maybe the lesson isn't about who changed their mind, but who opened their heart. What about you? Have you ever had your perspective shift? Not because you agreed, but because you truly listened? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.